Welcome, everyone. Happy Sabbath. Thanks for joining us. Last 2 Sabbaths ago, I spoke on the title of the sermon was called Same But Different. It was part 1. Now we're at Same or Different, but part 2. And Same or Different part 1 was basically how is it that God's people could sign on to ritual human sacrifice. In other words, I talked about how in the very beginning when God's people were brought out of the land of Egypt and they were brought into the promised land, God warned them several times, don't do as the people of the surrounding nations have done. Don't do as the Canaanites have done, who sacrifice their children, who commit sexual immorality. Don't do that. Don't do that. He warns them over and over again. And of course, we know the story that they did do that. They did sign on to roasting their children over the fire. They did sign on to ritual child human sacrifice. They did indeed do that. And this is part 2. And as I pointed out at the end of part 1, is that a great motivation for them to sign on to that was that they wanted to be like the nations around them. They wanted to sign on to the philosophy that existed at their times. They wanted to integrate themselves into a world economic model, which they did through the Phoenicians. So if none of that sounds familiar, please see part 1. I believe it is on YouTube. But today we're going to do part 2. And we're going to talk about world population, environment, and things like that. And we're going to talk about it, I think, in a little bit different perspective than we normally do. But it's interesting to know, does anyone know what the world's population is at this time? Nearly 8 billion, nearly working our way to 9 billion people. Now, a lot of people get upset and they say, well, we're destroying the environment, we have too many people. But did you know, fact, that you could fit the entire world's population in the state of Texas? The entire world population in the state of Texas. And all we ever hear about, we don't have enough resources, we don't have this, we don't have that. And I want to tell you that a lot of that has to do not with the size of the population, but the people who govern the various populations. In many countries where they have plenty of arable land, it is not used because the governments are so corrupt. In many countries where there's plenty of water underneath the soil, it is not harvested because governments are so corrupt. And so what I would argue to you is that we don't have so much a population problem, we have a corruption of the human heart problem. But before we go any further, I want you to see the difference between what the world teaches about population, what the Bible teaches about population, and where we have sort of gone astray. So before we do that, what are we going to do? Bow our heads in prayer. Let's do it. Gracious and Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day. We ask that you be with us as we try to rightly divide the word of truth. I pray for your Spirit, for me to be able to preach and teach effectively, and for the ears of those they may listen attentively, and also search their Bibles to see if what I'm saying is true. We thank you for this, Lord, and we ask that you be with us. In Jesus' holy name we pray. Amen. So in the very beginning, in Genesis chapter 1, we have the design of man and woman. And listen to what he says here in verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. The image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Now this is amazing because unlike modern environmentalist movements where we put man on equal with the animals, we say, well, the animals have rights too, and we should see what they want to do. We shouldn't build roads or housing developments or projects because we need to be concerned about limited, very small animals that might be disturbed by all this. We'll blow up hydroelectric dams and all this other stuff. But the idea is that God put man on the earth, and the earth was something that he was to have dominion over. Now, this doesn't mean that man is to destroy the earth because this is his home. You don't spill oil in your home just because you want to keep the lights on. You don't do things like that. You don't pollute your own house. You want to keep it clean. So as our house, yes, we do want to be stewards over it, but the truth of the matter is that man was to be head over all creation. That's how God designed it. And then he goes on this, and he created man in his own image. He's not created in the image of an animal. He's created in God's image. He did not evolve over billions of years. He was created in God's image. And then what else did he do? He created male and female. So no matter how people feel about whether I'm this gender or that gender, or I'm in between genders, or maybe one of the 57 other genders that social media tells us that exist, God says there's only 2. Now, you can argue with God, and that's fine. I assure you probably lose, but you can argue with him, but there's only 2 according to the Word of God. Now, society has told us otherwise and has told us a bunch of other things, but the last part I'm going to point out, and this is where we're going to spend most of our thought here, is this last one. And then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish, of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every creeping thing that moves on the earth. But the other command was what? To be fruitful and multiply. Now let's be very clear. This has nothing to do with polygamy. This has nothing to do with rampant promiscuity. This was all designed within the family. This was all designed with a loving family, with mother and father submitted to God. That's the plan that God had. But the idea was that family was part of God's heritage or gift to mankind. That was his gift, that mankind was to multiply and fill the earth with God-fearing children, teaching them in the fear of God. That was what we were supposed to do. That's the idea here. Now, many say, well, there's the flood, there's climate change, we have a lot of problems today. And I hear that. But I want you to see what God intended for man. And notice this idea of being fruitful and multiply to fill the earth is a blessing that is passed on from generation to generation, even after the flood. Notice after the flood. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth. Again, there's that dominion thing again. And on every bird of the air and all that move on the earth and over the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. As for you, be fruitful and multiply. Bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply in it. The idea was that there is enough resources for mankind, if he uses them effectively, to take care of growing families. Again, this is done in the fear of the Lord. This is done in the idea that they're responsible for taking care of every member of the house. But this was part of the blessing that God wanted to give his people. That's what he wanted to do. Again, even with the promise going to Abraham. Here we are in Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 through 6, and I had the verses incorrect. It is 15 through 16. He says, when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram. Now, the name Abram means either exalted father or father of height. That's literally father of height. And it says, and said to him, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless. Now, I just want you to see here, Abram's name was literally almost an insult to Abraham because he had no children. And he and Sarah had tried and tried and tried. And this isn't the first time he's made a covenant with him. This is the second time he has. He's made a covenant with him that he's going to bless him and he's going to make him the father of many nations. And so at this time in his life, he's like, well, what gives? I mean, we've been waiting on this, and yet my name is still the father of height, or the exalted father. And he goes on, he says, and I will make a covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. And he's like, okay, Lord, any day now, multiply me exceedingly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but you shall be called Abraham, which means father of a multitude. So he goes from the father, the exalted father, to the father of the multitude, which he doesn't even have a kid at this time. For I have made you a father of many nations, and I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you. Kings shall come from you. Think about that. That the blessing to Abraham, which, again, what do we talk about? That in the New Testament, in the New Covenant, that we are to have a living faith like Abraham, trusting in his promises. And at this time, these promises were not fulfilled. But what is one of the main features of the promise given to Abraham? To have children, to be fruitful and multiply. That was one of the promises that he should have. Again, this would be done in the fear of the Lord. In verse 15, he says, Then God said to Abraham, As for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be called her name, and I will bless her, and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be the mother of nations. Kings of people shall be from her. This idea that she's no longer just a princess, but she will be a mother, a queen. She will be able, think about it. The idea was that men and women following God could become kings and queens in their own home, raising up a nation, raising up chosen children. I just want you to think about this for a second. We like to talk about numbers. We like to talk about the growth of the church, and we talk about worldwide numbers. And in the West, the church is dying in many different denominations. Interestingly, the Orthodox and Catholic Church are growing quite rapidly in the West, which is interesting to note. But Protestantism is dying, and it is interesting to note that if Protestant denominations, including our own, if they had merely kept their own children in the church, just their own children, if they did no evangelism, if they did zero evangelism, and they just kept their kids, the numbers would be triple what they are today. Just keeping their children. Just locking the back door so Satan can't get in and take your kids away. If we had just done that, the numbers would be triple. That blessing would be ours. But you see, we've allowed the world to condition us, to get us how to think. And this has poisoned our thinking about families and children and raising them. He goes on, Genesis 35, 9 through 14. It says, then God appeared, and now notice the blessing goes from Abraham, then Isaac, and also to Jacob. And you'll see it here with Jacob as well. Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And he said to him, your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob anymore. This is after the wrestling. This is after the wrestling he did with the Lord, and he gave him the name Israel, but he's reiterating it yet again. He says, your name shall not be called Jacob anymore, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. Also, God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. Notice, God uses the authoritative name for himself, God Almighty. And notice the command, be fruitful and multiply. In other words, through faith, as you're raising children, be fruitful and multiply. Now, Jacob was actually at the end, pretty much the end of having children. I think after this, he has Benjamin and he's done. But the concept wasn't so much that he continues to have children. It was the concept that you raise your children and they have children. You teach them in the way of the Lord and they have God-fearing kids. That's the idea here. Again, this idea of the family being the bedrock of the faith is something that you find here strongly in Genesis, and you find it throughout all the way to the Revelation. But the problem is that we have blown it up and we said, well, it's just better to evangelize and not have families at all. And that doesn't come from the Bible. And so he goes on, he says, and a nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac I give to you and your descendants, and I give after you I give this land. And then God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. So Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, a pillar of stone, and poured out a drink offering on it, and poured out oil on it. And Jacob called the name of the place where he spoke with him Bethel. Bethel, the very place where he was told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, where kings would come through his lineage. Now, I was skipping, and there's many more. There's many more examples that I could point out about God continually. Part of the blessing that God gives to his faithful is the blessing of more children. It's what he does. It is the blessing of having a family. And again, this has been unfortunately perverted and hated upon. But notice this. After some time, you know the story that they're in Egypt with Joseph. And Joseph takes care of God's people during the famine. And of course, he becomes the second in command of all of Egypt. And he is able to turn Egypt into a powerhouse. And after of course, Joseph dies, another series of pharaohs comes in, and they, of course, no longer recognize God, and they no longer remember Joseph. And so what happens is they decide that they need to get on a plan, and the plan is to depopulate God's people, to convince them that they shouldn't have more children, to set it up so that the children would be killed, to do something to curb their population. Pharaoh does this. This isn't a command from Moses. Pharaoh himself says, I need to limit their population for the benefit of Egypt. And so, verse 7, but the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. But the more they afflicted them, so this is the Egyptians beating them, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. So again, they tried to make their work harder. They tried to take away their economic opportunity, but they kept having children and raising them in the fear of the Lord, and they were like, we got to do something about this. Their children belong to us. They belong to the state. We got to educate them. We got to get the parents to stop having kids. We got to do something because we need to preserve Egypt. That was their theory. And so what do? So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter and hard in bondage, and mortar and brick, and all manner of service in the field, and all the service which they made them was with severe rigor. And then what else do? What else do? Well, Pharaoh calls in the midwives, the chief midwives of all of Egypt. These were not just two midwives that served all of Egypt. These were the chief midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. And they were God-fearing Hebrews. And what did Pharaoh do? He said, look, when it's a male child that is born, as he's exiting the womb, you kill him. You kill him, because we got to do this for Egypt. It's for the good of all society. There's too many male Hebrew servants out there. How are we going to feed all these people? It's going to be an environmental catastrophe. You got to do something about it. And of course, Shiphrah and Puah, being God-fearing women, said, no, absolutely not. And so what did they do? They decided that they would delay their showing up to deliver those children. They probably also instructed other aged women to coach and help these women have babies. And then when they finally showed up, it was too late. They said, hey, sorry, Pharaoh, when we show up, the babies are already been born. And so what happens? Because of that, what does the Lord reward them with? Does he give them a 401k and a trust fund so they can travel around the world and take pictures of themselves in Bangladesh? Did he help them go on more vacations? Did he make them CEOs of the great Egyptian industry there or some tech? Is that what God did? He says, I know what I do. I know what's going to be great for women. I'm going to exalt them. I'm going to make them high into the state and give them power, and I'm going to make them a girl boss. That's what God's going to do. No, that's not what he did. How did he bless these women? Therefore, God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew mighty. And so it was because of the midwives that God had provided households for them. In other words, they had families. That's how God blessed them. Today, we would be like, no, make me a CEO. Send me on vacations. I don't want a family. That's drudgery. No. But see, notice the thinking that we have versus the thinking that they have. And this thinking just didn't come up on its own. This thinking has existed for quite some time. This is Thomas R. Malthus. And some of you will recognize the date that he actually came out with this theory. This is actually a reiteration, or what they call the Neo-Malthusian Society, and they republished his works in 1892. But his works were originally published in 1798, an interesting date. In 1798, and what he determined is he looked at agricultural products and he looked at populations. He said, I don't know. There's no way that with the growth of the human population, that's going to keep up with the supplies of food. And so what we need to do is we need to allow the surplus of the human population, especially the poor, we need to allow them just to die off. We need to allow the alcoholism, we need to allow the drugs, we need to allow the violence, we need to allow the disease, we need to allow to just kill them all off. And we need to put them in workhouses. And this is what he did. Many of you will remember there's a famous line in the Christmas Carol where Dickens puts in that when he's talking about the poor, the Ebenezer Scrooge actually says, well, let them be rid of the surplus population. That actually comes from Thomas R. Malthus. Dickens was not a fan of that, but that was at his time, that many people believed that it's just better to let them die so we have fewer mouths to feed. That was the idea. And Malthus also believed that death was a great hero. In other words, by many people dying, it allowed people to survive. It allowed more affluence and more opulence. And so Malthus was teaching this in 1798. Thomas R. Drysdale, or Charles R. Drysdale, the guy who is editing this book, he's commenting on Malthus's theories. And what he decides to tell you is that these theories are not new in 1798, but they're actually very old. And remember, as I was telling you in the past, in part one, that many societies practice human sacrifice, even child human sacrifice, but one of the reasons why they did it was to limit the population of their own cities. The ancients believed that. They said, hey, everything's good right now, but if we have too many people, that will reduce our economic standards, and we can't have that. So they would limit the populations. The Spartans used to take the children that they thought were the defective and throw them over the wall. And the Greeks used to have scapegoat rituals where they would take the poor and the disease and they would round them up and beat them with clubs and chase them out of the city or kill them because they wanted to get rid of the excess population. So it's not new, it's actually old. But in 1798, notice in 1892 when Charles Drysdale is writing about this, notice what he says here. The great philosophers of Greece, such as Plato and Aristotle, are the origin of all real civilization in succeeding ages throughout Europe. And they have saved us from the deluge of crude theologies such as those of Palestine or less cultured tribes. The so-called divine law of increase and multiply and replenish the earth and other equally vague and meaningless exclamations are the strongest contrast with the scientific reasoning of these masters of all the learned. So notice what he just said there. What does he say? The crude theologies of those of Palestine, who is he talking about? And the divine law, the so-called divine law of increase and multiply, what is he talking about? He's talking about the Bible, isn't he? And notice how he juxtaposes them. He goes, that's just crude, that's just anachronistic, but But we're following Plato and Aristotle. This is the science. This is science, and of course, many of us here love the science. We don't want to be ever seen as not following the science, right? I mean, I don't know of an insult worse than that. Hey, you're not following the science. Oh, I'm sorry. I better get back on the ball. And so notice the point here is that what they're doing is following the science, and the science says that you must limit the population. That's the point. And that is contrasted with what the Bible says. And he goes on, Plato in his Republic limits the number of free citizens in his ideal state to 5,040. Procreation, he maintains, when it proceeds too fast may be checked, or when it goes on too slowly may be encouraged by the proper distribution of honors and marks of ignominy, and by the admonitions of the elders to prevent or promote it according to the circumstances. In other words, a group of elites in society should dictate the size of the population. When they think it's too large, it needs to be culled. When they think it's too small, it needs to be encouraged. It is interesting to note that for many decades, China had a one-child policy. They had a one-child policy, and if you had more than two, they would forcibly sterilize and abort your child. That's what they did. And it is interesting that this is probably back in 2012. The National Public Radio did a whole expose on it, and it was fascinating because National Public Radio agrees with China in most cases. But one of the things they said is that the Chinese were suffering a demographics catastrophe. In other words, that they have a younger population that is so small that they cannot support the older population. They cannot take care of their families. And think about it, if you only had one child and your child dies at 35 and you're still going to keep living, you have no one to take care of you. And at that point, when the government takes care of you, they do what they do in Canada. They have what they call the maid service, and that is assisted suicide. So they'll just take care of you that way. Now, people are like, well, and for years, for decades, people were applauding China, saying, hey, they're saving the planet, one-child policy, amen, hallelujah. That's what they were saying. And in China, now you have children who are the only child, and they are unwilling to do the work that their family members were doing before them. They are willing to work as hard as their family members. Worse than that, they selectively aborted young girls because they wanted boys to carry on the family name. So that these Chinese men have to look to Korea, they have to go to the United States, they have to find Asian women wherever they can because there's not enough of them in their own country because they got rid of them. So despite all the scientific and celebration for them following the science, it kind of blew up in their face. And NPR, out of all outlets, actually reported on it. And so he goes on, and notice what he says here. Plato also anticipated Mr. Darwin himself and the modern Darwinians who lay such great stress on the point of rational selection of parents. This is eugenics, of course. In the 5th book of his Republic, he proposes that the most healthy men should be joined in marriage to the finest specimens among women, and the inferior citizens should be paired with each other. Next, he proposes that the children of the first class alone shall be brought up, and the others not. That's the idea, and you go, wait, don't we kind of have something similar to that? Well, it's interesting that since he brought up Darwin, because again, Malthus was in 1798 publishing his works, Darwin was greatly inspired by Malthus. This is a quote from the editor of the Origins of Species in 1909, and this is what he says about Darwin's views on Malthus. He's actually quoting a letter. He says, I happened to read for amusement Malthus on population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on from long continued observation of habits of animals and plants, it once struck me that under these circumstances favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones would be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of a new species. Here then I had at last got the theory which to work. In other words, the idea of the survival of the fittest, natural selection, was informed by Malthus, because Malthus said that when populations get too high, there's famine, disease, destruction. And the point is that Darwin said, well, yes, death is the ultimate creator. By eliminating the surplus population, we get a stronger population. We get the smarter species. We get the tougher animals. This is what we want. And of course, this would later be applied to what we know of as social Darwinism, where there was eugenics and all this other stuff. But I just want you to see that their goal from the very beginning was to say that death is the hero, that killing off human beings, killing off animals isn't just favorable, but it helps the species evolve to a new and higher state. And again, this was all inculcated into society. This is Life magazine in 1948. And in here, they talk about the decades to come. So this is 1948. They were predicting in 1948, by the year 2000, there would be worldwide famines and population drop-offs. Many of you here are alive since 2000, and some of you lived through it. How many of you remember that great die-off that happened in 2000? How many of you? Go ahead, it's okay. I know many of us here have been paying attention. How many of you remember the worldwide famine that happened with billions of people? It didn't happen, did it? That's one of the many predictions that these people have made that actually never came to pass. And they talked about what they would do, how the UN would need to work in every single nation to make sure that we were getting enough food, that we were controlling the population. But they were very afraid. In 1948, it was in the popular press that we were going to overpopulate and the world was going to crash. Again, not to be outdone, in 1948, this continued in 1970 in Life magazine again. And they were promoting this. This man was a mathematician at a university in New Jersey. He was a mathematician. He was 34 years old. His wife was 31. And they decided, not because they didn't have the means, they decided not because they didn't have good insurance or he didn't have a stable job, and not because his wife had to work, she was a stay-at-home mom, they decided that he needed to have a vasectomy to save the world from overpopulation. Notice the title, One Man's Answer to Overpopulation, Have a Vasectomy. No more than 3 kids. Actually, they actually only wanted 2, but they adopted 1 and then had 2 others, and they didn't mean to. So, in other words, he was convinced that he needed to do his part to save the world from overpopulation. And so this was actually controversial because people thought, well, there's something wrong with sterilizing men or getting yourself sterilized, especially in your 30s. Why would you do that? But his answer is, we got to do it to save the world. And again, this was something controversial, and they were promoting the pill. They were trying to make a contraceptive for men that you could put in the arm that would eliminate your ability to produce sperm. They also promoted the birth control pill. Now, it is interesting to note that there's what you call perimenopause syndrome. Perimenopause syndrome means that before you get into your 40s, you stop having periods, you lose your fertility. And one of the things they found is that women who have been put on birth control at a very early age, they actually suffer higher rates of perimenopause syndrome. In other words, their ovaries just shut down. They lose the ability to stop having kids. Now, on top of that the birth control pill increases your rates for cancer, increases your rates for heart disease, for stroke. It messes with your body. And yet, there was a push at one time to make it over the counter so any woman can give it. And if anyone has a daughter who's ever had acne or anything, you go to a regular medical doctor, the first thing they'll tell you, well, we can fix that. Just put her on the pill. That'll normalize her hormones, acne will go away. Oh, she has pain with menstruation? Put her on the pill. She's got headaches? Put her on the pill. Whatever it is, put her on the pill, knowing for a fact that by the time she's in her 30s, she may have no fertility left. That was their plan, and it worked splendidly. But I want you to see something here. Also in the 1970s, there was an oil spill just off the coast here of Tampa. And I know many of you haven't been able to go to the beach since the 1970s because there's still oil everywhere, right? Right. They were able to clean it up. It's interesting, though, like this oil comes from the earth, and somehow you think that the earth doesn't have the ability to deal with it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't clean up, you shouldn't do this or that, but it's kind of interesting. But nonetheless, after this oil spill, there was a push in the public press and media to say that we need to make overpopulation an environmental issue. And you can see here all the terrible disaster. They show this poor duck here. It's awful. And they show this heroic woman spreading hay on the oil while standing barefooted. I'm not sure what she's doing there. And then there's a guy chasing after a bird in oil. Again, they put this all here as this is a great heroic struggle to save the environment. And then they show them spraying worse chemicals on top of the water to get the oil to sink to the bottom. Again, government has the ability to tell you it's helping you. Well, it's not. But the conclusion of it, here's the conclusion. I want you to hear the conclusion in Life magazine after talking about this horrible disaster. And believe me, I'm not for oil spills. I'm not for any of these things. I love having clean water, pure air. I'm very much into conserving the environment. I definitely believe in it. I just don't believe that eliminating the human population in SUVs is going to do it. So notice how Life magazine pivots to this popular idea and what we should do to save the environment. He says, yet even if a fraction of such sums is forthcoming, there will be other problems as well. Disruption for large industries, higher bills for consumers, and most important, the considerable trauma for all of us adopting a less wasteful and therefore less convenient style of living. People who would no longer be jousting at greedy business or mindless technology for their environmental woes, but fighting their own instincts, both the spendthrift ones and the economizing ones. And government here would have to face a hard choice about the environment between the scattergun cosmetic approach and making such real national commitment, dwarfing even the space program. Such a commitment might also involve, besides vast sums, more economic and population planning by government than any of us relish. So notice his point is that if we're going to get serious about the environment, we need to invest more money than we did in the space program, and part of that's going to be serious talks about reducing the population. And this was a popular talking point back then, that in order to save the environment, we got to address the population. And don't get me wrong, the pharmaceutical companies love this idea of population as well. This is EMCO, and they made a birth control product. And notice what they say here: if you make life, make it worth living. And you see here the woman here. This is the actual advertisement. Now I just want to stop right here. This is the actual advertisement. And in here, in 1970 Life magazine, notice what they're celebrating. They're celebrating co-ed dorms, strange as that is. So here's the thing. They understand that promiscuity is a great way to encourage birth control and abortion. Families do not need those type of things, not the way that the world does. So in other words, hedonistic promiscuity falls into their program. And notice they have an advertisement right there for birth control. And listen to what it says. Overpopulation, a threat to the future? You're half right. Overpopulation and pollution is the problem today. So look, the pharmaceutical company, the friendly pharmaceutical company, has your healthcare needs in mind and the environmental needs in mind. Notice, isn't that nice? I feel hugged already just thinking about it. And it says overpopulation reduces the quality of life for everyone. There's not enough clean air to breathe, no clean water, and a shortage of housing and the school rooms, traffic jams, and the problems are increasing every day. What can you do about this? I mean, what can I do? I got to save the planet. The most responsible step you can take is to limit the size of your family. Thank you, EMCO. I'm so thankful for that. But here it is. Notice how they promote this, because this was a big deal to them. This is the New Scientist. This is a British scientific magazine, so to speak, so-called. In 1974, I just want you to, so Dr. John Lorraine is very upset about overpopulation, and he writes a lot of articles, and I'm only going to take a couple snippets here from what he says, but I want you to see what he thinks is part of the solution to overpopulation. So we're going to read the last three paragraphs over on the far left, or my far left. Notice what he says here. In the developed world, there is now evidence of a new female radicalism. In the early part of the century in Britain, the suffragette movement was the focus for change. Many women suffered considerable trauma and degradation in order to obtain the right to vote. Now the whole question of women's rights has again thrust itself forward in many Western societies. For example, in France, a nation in which attitudes to reproduction tend to be highly conservative, the women's liberation movement constitutes a strong pressure group on the government to liberalize laws in relation to sex and birth control. In Britain, the women's liberation movement stands for free contraception and abortion on demand, for round-the-clock nursery facilities for children, and equal pay for equal work, and equal education and job opportunity. They might, with advantage, also include into their credo a request for more tolerant attitude towards female homosexuality. For in this day and age should have the right For who in this day and age should have the right to pillory the lesbian and to assert that because she does not fit with the conventional wisdom of the male-dominated society, she would be an object of derision and opprobrium? So what he's saying is here, he's looking at the women's liberation movement. And he says they need to promote homosexuality. That would actually be good for them. But what they're doing and saying abortion on demand and birth control and getting women in the workforce, this is good because this will reduce the population. And notice what he says here in the next paragraph. The views of the women's liberation movement have an antinatalist, it means anti-birth, flavor, and could therefore form an important segment of the national population policy. In other words, the very things that the women's liberation movement would help to reduce the surplus population. women in the workforce, not being mothers, women having free access to birth control, women having abortions on demand. This will be wonderful to solve the problem for overpopulation. And he goes on, certainly there is no question that on moral grounds alone, discriminatory barriers to women should be removed through the whole spectrum of society in Britain. But such legislation could also have a beneficial effect in the general field of overpopulation. For example, it could lead to a later age of marriage. And the recent exemplar of the People's Republic of China, again, they were celebrating that, and the traditional example of the Irish Republic indicate that this can be associated with falling birth rates, and it could lead to appreciation of the advantages likely to accrue to the individual from smaller family size and might increase the incidence of childless marriage. So notice, all the things that we talk about in politics today, he understands are a means to an end to reduce the population. Think about it. We talk about same-sex marriages. We talk about transgender reassignment surgeries. We talk about all of it. And he understood way back then, no. That's not bad in itself. It is a means to an end to accomplish our goal to get rid of more people on this earth. And including getting women out in the workforce, making sure that they have equal pay and they invest and they become girl bosses. That helps. Here they are again, and this is another article in 1974. And this is again, John Lorraine again. Again, as I told you, he writes a lot about this, and we're just going to read these last two paragraphs over the end. And he just says, the most important item in population policy for that developed country, such as Britain, is that the government should publicly acknowledge the size and distribution of the population is its rightful concern. Lord Shepherd's statement went to some distance to meet this point, and one can only hope for the increasing governmental involvement in the areas in the months to come. Effective voluntary measures to halt the population growth should be introduced without delay. These would include a considerable increase in the facilities for contraception and for male and female sterilization, together with the retention of a liberal abortion law. Most importantly, the new government must be prepared to launch a massive program of population education, providing for factual information on human reproduction and birth control, on the undesirability of unwanted pregnancies, and on the advantages which accrue to the individual and the nation by the reduction of family size. Now, I love this because today we think, well, that was back then. That doesn't happen today. Well, on social media for young women, on TikTok and YouTube, there's women who go around and celebrate how they don't have children. They're by themselves. They say, I don't need to get married. I don't need a man. I don't need children. Look how happy I am traveling and working at some job 40 hours a week for people who don't even care about me. And it's celebrated. And people go, well, look how happy we are not having kids. Look at it. The same program is still happening today. People think that transgenderism is really about psychological health. Well, let me be very clear. Once you start to get on those hormones, once you start to just try to block puberty, right? You're probably at a 98% risk for losing your fertility completely. Completely. For life. It's gone. So think about that. All of this, what he's saying, is happened and has happened and continues to happen. And we're just like, all right, where did that come from? It's all there. And he says the new government should also make a radical reappraisal of the roles of women in society. And in this field, rhetoric is not enough. Political action must be the order of the day. It must be recognized that although some women, the roles of wife and mother are attractive to others, such lifestyles are far from popular. According to discriminatory barriers facing women should be removed and their equality and opportunity assured throughout the whole spectrum of society. And in our overcrowded islands, such legislation might have beneficial results, all pointing to an anti-natalist direction. That means less children. These would include later age of marriage, greater proportion of childless marriage, and a smaller female size, and an increased incidence of spinsterdom. That's right. This doesn't sound very loving to women that, hey, I want you to be alone, have no one to take care of you in your old age, and die without any family or friends. That's essentially what he's saying, because it's for the good of the earth. It's for the good of the population. Now, they were actually quite effective. You think that these things didn't happen. I assure you that these things did. And in this article in 1972, this gentleman who writes in mentions that all these things are actually having effect. And indeed is interesting because the population in Great Britain in 1974 was 56 million. In 2022, it is 68.5 million. That was putting the brakes on the population. They did exactly what they said. They reduced their population. They shut it down. And again, what do they have for it? I don't think it's helped many people over there. And now they have to import an entirely foreign population to make up for the numbers that they don't have. This is in 1972, and this is what the gentleman says. What are the reasons for the decline in birth? So they already noticed it in 1972. All the things that they were trying to do to reduce the population were already having its effect in 1972. He goes, what are the reasons for the decline in birth rates in the developed countries? They are generally accepted as including married women working increasingly outside of the home, improvement in women's education, and therefore their job opportunities, and spread of family planning movement, and the methods of contraception, abortion, and sterilization, and the fear of overpopulation leading to public disapproval of large families. So notice, all of this worked in their favor. You think that it was always just a political debate. Well, life, choice, these people are your masters. They decide what we get to do, and they get to decide what we see on TV, they get to decide what we hear on the radio, they get to decide what we read in our textbooks, and their program from a long time has been no more population, especially for God-fearing people. They don't care about others. God-fearing people, why? Because the blessing that God wanted to bestow to mankind was God-fearing families that would fill the earth with faith and truth. And they have done their best to reduce it. And they've been very effective. And not only have they been very effective in the world, they've been very effective in the church. This is Horace E. Walsh. He is a pastor, and he's writing in the Review and Herald. Some of you have probably heard about this magazine. This is published in 1971. And I want you to see what he believes is a real problem, okay? He really does believe there's a problem. Now, you can trust him because he got his Bachelor of Divinity from the Adventist Theological Seminary, so you can trust him. But this is what he says in 1971. The problem of environmental pollution is really quite closely allied to population explosion. Well, look at that. He's already making the connection. We got to save the environment by reducing the population. The latter contributes to the former. One of the greatest ways in which man abuses nature is through his sheer numbers. It took the first 5,000 years to raise man's number to 1 billion, and then less than 100 to double the world population to 2 billion to the mark it reached in the 1920s. To double this again to 4 billion, the mark experienced in the 1980s, will have taken less than 60 years. Projections now run to 7 billions by 2000, and now the doubling time seems to be about 37 years. In the book, The Population Bomb by Dr. Ehrlich, gives a projection that should make one even more thankful that God will soon intervene to solve the population explosion problem. Now, don't you love that? Jesus is going to return to save us from overpopulation. He just said that. Now, again, you can trust him. He was educated at the seminary. So you can trust him. He read a book that is Worldly Philosophy by Dr. Paul Ehrlich, and he believes it. He believes because it's science. Why would you not trust the science? This is all science that we're talking about here, even though none of their predictions ever came true. So he believes that Jesus is going to return to save us from overpopulation. And he goes on. He states that if the present growth rate is maintained for about 900 years, I'm not sure where he gets that is, there will be 60 billion people on the face of the earth. The British physicist J.H. Fremlin is cited as indicating that such a multitude might be housed in a continuous 2,000-story building covering the entire planet. I mean, so foolish. It's not even ridiculous. We're going to skip down to the very bottom. He says one of the most dangerous, and then we're going to the next paragraph. One of the most dangerous aspects of the population explosion is the fact that the greatest increases are in countries which are badly undernourished and overpopulated. In 1966, while the world's population increased to 70 million people, there was no compensatory increase in food production. That's actually not true. In 1966, each person had 2% less to eat. That's still not true. With the population bomb, there remains a deterioration of our environment, and many sociologists and psychiatrists say this is a serious threat to mental health of the nation. More and more are they coming to regard the deteriorating psychic environment as significant cause of riots, rising crime, dissatisfaction of youth, and the addition to dangerous drugs, by millions of Americans. Then he says, the prophecy of Paul in the last days that perilous times shall come was never more up to the minute than it is today. Now, so he believes that Paul talking about perilous times is due to this overpopulation. Now, I'm sorry. Please come up to me after the sermon. You have from Genesis to Revelation, all right? Show me one time that God gets upset at his people for having too many people. If you can do that, I'd be glad to see it because I'm pretty sure it's not there. I'm just saying it's not there. But notice that he makes this case because he's not influenced by the Bible at this point. The Bible is no longer his textbook. Paul Ehrlich is his textbook. Thus saith the science is his textbook. He's following the drumbeat of the world, and that's why he says this. He may be a good man. He may have been a godly man, but he is deluded on this point, and you can see that. Now, I'm just going to go here. This was articles published in 1984. This is talking about the UN World Population Summit that they had in Mexico City. And I just want you to see this here because it's very important to see what they mean, what they want to implement by controlling the population. And so you can see it in the large paragraph. He says some issues are still taboo because they are controversial and could breach a consensus, said Leon Taba, a former director of the UN Population Division. He said that they include abortion and sterilization, the two most widespread ways of controlling births in the third world. So I just want you to keep that in mind. The UN has never backed off from that point. The UN to this very day believes that the two most effective means of curbing population is abortion and sterilization. That's what they mean, all right? I just want you to understand that. So they're very concerned about this, the natural environment, everything, but I want you to see that. Now, here's another magazine. Many of you know this was published in 1984. And this article is in response to what you just read from the UN, from their population summit, and how they're worried about overpopulation. This was published by Gary M. Ross. He was the Associate Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty of the GC. So, you know, many people were disappointed with the religious liberty and public affairs, especially they were disappointed with many of the leaders in that division of the church during the pandemic. Well, if you were disappointed in them, this is not going to change your mind about disappointment. So here it is in 1984, and this is him commenting on, keep in mind, this is him commenting on the UN, and he's commenting on this population conference in Mexico City. So this is what he says, starting at the first red arrow. He says, futurists may debate, but I personally would not minimize the risk of crowding, hunger, and environmental disaster. In recent issue of Foreign Affairs, Robert McNamara establishes the hard fact that progress against overpopulation is uneven, with politically stable regions doing far better in this regard than the third world, which brings up the point for opponents of abortion. Population pressure apparently is not a priority. So notice, the people who oppose abortion, these radical Christians who are just reading their Bible saying, I don't think that's right, they clearly aren't sophisticated enough to understand the issue that we're all facing with overpopulation. That's his point right there. These retrogrades do not realize the scientific consensus that we're overpopulating, and so we need to actually get rid of more people, and so they're not thinking about the health of the world, they're only thinking about the morality of abortion. That's what he's saying here. And he goes on, either because they are more optimistic about the future, or because the world's collective life is unreal to them, or because population control may encourage the practice of abortion. How dare they, is basically what he's saying. I write in the wake of the International Conference on Population in Mexico City. At that meeting, the biggest of its kind in 10 years was being planned. The White House, the Office of Policy Development, advised the administration to refuse the United States assistance into population control programs that advocate abortion. The conservatives who prompted this action were applauded. Parts of the scientific community objected. So notice, the conservatives who were representing the people that they were elected to represent, who did not want the United States funding abortion, he says the scientific community was upset because they don't realize how important abortion is to reducing overpopulation. This is what he says. And again, this is our religious liberties. This is one of the associate directors of religious liberties in 1984. So you can tell that they had some wires crossed even back then. And he goes on. He says this. He says yes, without reversal or compromise of the government's position, such countries as India and Bangladesh stand to lose upward of $120 million a year in family planning and aid. That means that those countries would lose access to their abortions and sterilizations being paid for. That's what he means. And then he goes on, opposing abortion in this context worsens our population pressures, but pro-lifers have an out in the international arena. They might manifest concern for the quality of life. If they say no to the reduction of population through abortion, it would seem that they must say yes to the betterment of life for the expanded population that is likely to result. Of course, enormous expenditures of money are at stake here. So notice, he's like, well, if they're going to reject the science in regards to overpopulation, they're going to have to pony up and start paying for all these people. That's his argument. That it's okay to promote abortion because abortion is an effective means in reducing the population. And anyone who thinks opposite just isn't hip with the science. Again, here's another article in the review. This is in 1974. And this was published by the editor at the time. And he's very concerned with overpopulation. I just want you to see this. I want you to understand this for a second, because I know some of you, your eyes are glazing over. This is frustrating. But I want you to understand this. The people writing these articles didn't get this from the Bible. I want you to understand that you can read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. This position is not a biblical position. And this should bother you. Shouldn't we, if we're going to have a position on population, on abortion, on birth control, shouldn't the Bible be the first and foremost text? Not what the world says, not thus saith the science. And so here they are following thus saith the science, signing on to these things. And so the last paragraph at the end says, the current energy crisis happens to be a reckoning time. Man has not done well in managing Earth's resources. In December news conference, Lester R. Brown, staff member of the Overseas Development Council, pointed out that a single poor harvest in the United States and Canada could trigger worldwide food shortage, at least as serious as the energy crisis, because the United States and Canada together control a large share of the world's exportable supply of cereal than the Middle East of oil. A combination of factors are developing that easily guarantee world famine by the 2000s, even without a crop failure. So remember, I told you that in the 1948, they were predicting by 2000 people would be dying of a worldwide famine. And this gentleman, the editor of the review, is saying that, oh, well, this is going to happen. And then he says this, the pressure of population increases coupled with the rising affluence, which promotes people to purchase meal derived from grain-fed animals, creates an intensifying international competition for the limited supply of grain and grain-based protein. All this at a time when the scarcity of land is available for agriculture in the developed world, and a deterioration of the quality of land through erosion, deforestation, and overpopulation in undeveloped nations. In addition, fertilizer shortages owing to the current energy crisis, plus water shortages in some sections of the world, are serious and frequent flooding in countries, in part because of man's abuse of the land. Make a gloomy picture indeed if new factors aren't suddenly introduced in the near future. So notice, he's very concerned that we are not taking care of the environment. We're not concerned about overpopulation. We're not doing enough because 2000 is going to come and it's going to be really bad. Now you would think, in the review, he would be talking about maybe Jesus coming in 2000. But he's more concerned about overpopulation. That's what you would think. And again, this is the point. Thus saith the science rules. Now you go, well, so what? So what? I mean, these guys in the review, that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't influence our policy or understanding of abortion. Well, actually it did. In 1989, George B. Gaynor wrote an article in Spectrum magazine, and he talks about how did we derive our abortion policy. And he goes on here, he's quoting Neil C. Wilson, who was the president of the North American Division. And we're just going to read this section right here, okay? Because Neil C. Wilson gave this quote to a magazine, all right? This is what he says. The church deplores anything that would contribute to declining morals and would steer away from anything which would encourage promiscuousness. Therefore, we would not feel it our responsibility to promote laws to legalize abortion, nor oppose them. Though we walk the fence, SDAs lean towards abortion rather than against it, because we realized we are confronted by big problems. So wait, here are the big problems. This is why we support abortion. Here are the big problems. Hunger and overpopulation. We do not oppose family planning and appropriate endeavors to control population. So even our own policy, and again, I don't know, did you see a Bible verse in there? I didn't. Again, influenced by the world, influenced by the UN, influenced by anything else but the Bible, anything. And that's how that policy was established, because they were worried about overpopulation, something that never happened the way they said it was going to happen. But we weren't done with that, because even in the 1990s, we have a gentleman from Nigeria, Luka Tambaya David, who you would think would be very skeptical of any means to control the population, being from Africa, seeing firsthand what they did to those people there. But notice how he's very concerned about this, and he talks about overpopulation. And notice who he's going to talk about as an authority that we should follow. He says, we may not be directly facing the dire events that Jeremiah and Jesus spoke of, but the lesson we should take circumstances into account in planning our families certainly applies. The economic situation in the world, especially in the so-called third world, daily emphasizes that the earth cannot sustain the exploding population. On July 13th, 1987, the United Nations funded for population activities proclaimed baby Mare Gaspar of the northern city of Zagreb, Yugoslavia, to be the 5 billionth citizen on this planet. Mare was not only one of the estimated 240 babies per minute, estimated of the 240 babies per minute, or 340,000 a day that were born that year. So notice, I love this. He uses that rate to say, well, we got a real problem. I mean, 240 babies a minute, 340,000 a day. Well, this is terrible. Another source reveals that the 4 billionth child was born in 1975, and it says that if the present population growth rate were not more than maintained, that the 6 billionth child will be born in the year 2000. Again, still doom saying about the year 2000. The size of the Earth's population is alarming, since 3/4 of the Earth's surface, is water, and humans share the rest with deserts, forests, mountains, plants, and animals. Compounding the problem, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organizations survey found that the land degradation could reduce food production over the long haul nearly by 20% if conservation measures are not taken. Some 544 million hectares of essential rain-fed croplands could be lost. Thus, the organization's ambition to provide food for all by the year of 2000 seems a mere mirage. When the beginning of human history, God instructed Adam and Noah to populate the earth, the problem was that it was the lack of people. That instruction does not speak to our times when the problem is of overpopulation. So he makes a strong case here. You go, well, okay, okay, Luca, maybe you're making a good point. Because notice he says the claims that some practicing birth control violates the principle that does not hold up. In fact, family planning compromise part of the Christians relating responsibly to this world. So he's very much into, we got to do something to save the planet. And so notice, because he's from Nigeria, he understands this very carefully. And so notice what he's going to say here. He's going to admit this truth. It is true that Margaret Sanger, the pioneer of modern family planning organizations, made statements that suggest that her motives were tainted with racism and elitism. She is quoted as saying that more children from the fit, less from the unfit, that the chief aim of birth control to create the race of thoroughbreds. In the mind of this Irish American, the unfit members of society were blacks, Mexicans, Americans, Jews, Mexican Americans, Jews, Indians, Spanish, and Italian Americans, the poor, the illiterate, the handicapped, and the criminals. She advocated that all these should be eliminated by massive sterilization programs she herself described as polite genocide, a dehumanizing program that Hitler and Nazi Germany later adopted. The unpalatable, now notice, he admits all of this. He's right, that's all true. The unpalatable early history of modern family planning has made many of the third world suspect that the richer countries prefer promoting birth control to providing funds to combat hunger in poorer nations. But whatever the ulterior motives may have crept into family planning, the fact that prevailing societal, social, and economic realities worldwide prove that the scheme is necessary. So notice, he goes, yeah, I know that that's what they said, but they're right. We do need to do something about the population. So even though he knows that they tried to snuff out the third world, they tried to go after the defectives, they tried to use eugenics, he knows it's all true, but he goes, but there's still truth in it, and we still need to follow it. And he goes on, ironically, it is usually the poor individuals in each country and the poor countries in the world that delight in mass production of children. It is rather unfortunate since it is reported that these poor countries found in Asia, Africa, and Latin America make up 75% of the world's population, but produce only 50% of the world's food. If these poorer countries do not want to starve or beg for a living from the richer ones, then they should embrace family planning ideals. Planned Parenthood allows couples to choose the number of children they have without coercion. I love that, without coercion. It's friendly. They're just helping you out, either natural or it should be artificial. China's population of 1 billion has forced that nation to enact laws making it a crime for any Chinese couple to have more than 2 children. In conclusion, proper training and care for children is a sacred obligation. It affects both our own souls and those of our children. Hence the need for proper planning. The seriousness of the matter is underscored in 1 Timothy 5:8 as follows: if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So notice. He's very concerned again with overpopulation. And he even says that we should embrace Planned Parenthood. We should embrace the truth of overpopulation. Yes, Margaret Sanger and others were bad, but it's still true. We need to do something about it. And then a few years later, 5 years later, we have this statement. This is one of the many official statements. This is an official statement on climate change. Many of you didn't know that the church had an official statement on climate change. So I'm going to read it to you today. It's very exciting. It says, scientists warn that the gradual warming of the atmosphere as a result of human activity will have serious environmental consequences. The climate will change, resulting in more storms, more floods, and more droughts. Now, what is it Jesus says in Matthew chapter 24? There'll be earthquakes, famines, right? Pestilence, right? He says that, but then he says because of climate change? No, Jesus didn't say that, did he? He says that because the world is becoming more sinful. But here we are, to the entire world, making a statement saying that, well, this is due to climate change. Now, prior to this, does anyone remember before it was called climate change, what it was actually called? Do you remember what it was called? Global cooling. Global cooling. As a matter of fact, you can go back and read articles from the 1980s where they said we were going to experience another ice age. And then they realized, ooh, that's not working. And then they said global warming, and now they're like, we'll just call it climate change. Getting more precise as we get more scientific. To keep climate change within breathable limits, the emissions of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, need to be significantly reduced. Industrialized countries are the main source of these emissions, while the first victims are the small island states and low-lying coastal countries. Again, where is this in the Bible? It's not there. And the science behind it is dubious at best. Despite the clear risk, governments appear slow to act. So we have to do something, I guess. The world membership in the Seventh-day Adventist Church requests that the governments concerned take the steps necessary to avert danger by fulfilling the agreement of Rio de Janeiro 1992 and stabilize carbon dioxide emissions to the year 2000 by the year 2000 at 1990 levels, by establishing plans for further reductions in carbon dioxide emissions after the year 2000, and by initiating more forcefully public debate on the risks of climate change. By signing this statement, the Seventh-day Adventists declare their advocacy for a simple, wholesome lifestyle where people do not step on the treadmill of unbridled consumerism and production of waste. They call for respect for creation, restraint in the use of the world's resources, and reevaluation of our needs as individuals. This was made in 1995. This is still the official statement on climate change. Now, I want you to notice this, that they're signing off onto what was said in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. Now, how many of you, be modest, how many of you went ahead and you were very interested and read the 1992 statement in Rio de Janeiro, right? No one here, right? And they know that you never read it, because if you did, you might be a little concerned. So if you read the 1992 statement in Rio de Janeiro, what you find is some very interesting things. And I don't have time to read all of it, but there's themes here. A lot of it is that responsible family planning, women having access to reproductive care, reproductive education. In other words, responsible parenthood. They say these things over and over and over again. They want to make sure that women are making the choices for their own bodies. They say that they need to have national reviews and survey what the population is doing in regards to its resources. Here they are again, sustainable development with families, and of course they want to establish UN Agenda 21 as well. That's very important to them. That they have to stop the overconsumption and the expanding world population, that governments need to take active steps in implementing all these things, and one of it is family size and access to birth control and family planning. Like, this needs to be done. Over and over again they mention this. And again, I'm not even done. There's more statements that says reproductive health needs to be considered in mind. Family size needs to be considered in mind. Again, having affordable health care. Services, so that again, women can continue benefiting from all these things to help reduce the population. Now, I just want to stop right here. In that 1992 statement, they never declare that the two most widespread ways of controlling births in the third world are abortion and sterilization. In other words, they don't go away from that. In that language, talking about family planning, about reproductive freedom, about taking care of women, making sure they have access to reproductive care, and all of that, are these two things right here. This is exactly what they've done. They're signing on to it. This is the 1992 statement. This is in there. And just for a bonus, because I just want you to see here, we signed on to this 1992. We're like, yes, the 1992 statement. We want governments to sign on to this. This is very important. And again, they have some good things in there. They do talk about helping people have access to running water. But since it's interesting, though, they talk about people having access to running water, and they even talk about traditional herbal medicine. They actually did. I was surprised to read it. But since 1992, and many of us have been alive since 1992, have they dug more wells for water? Have they actually improved the agriculture in the third world? No, they haven't done any of that. They haven't done any of that, but they have helped them to get more access to women's reproductive care. They have done that. They have helped them with abortions and sterilizations. They have done that. So they have kept part of their word. They never wanted to take care of them. But I want you to see this as an added bonus because, again, when you sign on to the UN, it's kind of like the law. You can't just take one part. You got to take it all. And so what else did they want? What else did they say that was a big deal? Now, this is with climate change, right? So the 1992 Rio de Janeiro statement has everything to do with climate change. But if you look carefully here, they talk about how important it is for climate change that people get access to everyone's favorite injectable pharmaceutical products. You can see it right here. They need improved vaccines. They need to have more vaccines. They need to develop more vaccines. And your livestock needs to have access to more vaccines. How is this helping us from climate change? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. Why would this have anything to do with that? It's interesting. We signed on to this statement in 95 saying we endorse that as a church. I want you to see this here. The UN has never changed its tune about population. We like to say, no, they're just trying to help us with climate change and save the planet. No. They've never. Even, notice this, population growth. This is directly off their website. I took it just a week ago. This is directly off their website. Population growth, environmental degradation, and climate change. Listen to what it says here. SDG stands for Sustainable Development Growth. Achieving sustainable development growth targets related to reproductive health, education, and gender equality will require empowering individuals, particularly women, to make choices about the number and timing of their children. The experience of countries from all regions suggests that such changes will facilitate and could potentially accelerate the anticipated slowdown in global population growth over the coming decades. In other words, the major implement in fighting climate change is population reduction. In 95, we signed on to that very statement. We said, yes, we do. How many of you remember this back in 2010? 2010, a technology guru, the guy who helped found Microsoft, he decided to do a TED Talk where he talked about the population. He was very concerned about population and CO2. And he was like, we got to do something here. And he put this equation on here. So here's the equation. We have CO2, which we all know. We have P, S, E, and C. All right? Does anyone know what the P, S, E, and C stand for? That's okay, because here we go. People. The P stands for people. S, services per person. E, energy per service. And C, CO2 unit of energy. And you know what he said? He said this, and you can watch it, still on YouTube. He goes, one of these numbers has got to get down to pretty much zero in order to save the planet. He talked about that right there on the stage, and people were like, thank you, Bill. We're following the science here. And think about this. He's just reiterating what the UN is already saying. He's just reiterating. And of course, he also believes that part of that is making sure that people in the third world have access to health cares and new vaccines, of course. And he says it himself. Watch the video. He actually says those very things. But he says all that while he's telling you we're going to try to get population growth pretty much down to zero because we have to save the planet. But hey, that statement by Bill Gates in 2010 did not dissuade anyone at the General Conference. Instead, in 2015, you know what they decided to do? They decided to retrench their statement in 1995 supporting the UN in 1992. So this statement here also says that they're going to support climate change. So it's like we didn't have enough in 95 that we needed to make another statement in 2015. So they made another statement. And notice what it says here. As world leaders gather in Paris for the 21st United Nations Climate Change Conference, the Seventh-day Adventist Church supports and applauds the efforts of these leaders to come to an agreement to stem the deterioration of our Earth due to climate change. And then again, from there, they say, hey, look, we already released Look, guys, we're friends with you. We already released a statement back in 95. We're your friends. We follow you guys. That's what we did. Signed up right for it, not even a hesitation. And again, this is in 2024. Earth.org, who also follows the UN. Notice what the big deal for them in helping save the planet from climate change. I just want you to see this. They show all the things about how effective these measures are. Not using a dryer, using green energy, live free with a car, upgrade light bulbs, recycle, eat a plant-based diet. All of those, look how small it is. But the biggest one is having one child or less. That's what they promote. Being single, not having children, going on vacations, putting women in the workforce, destroying the home, all of that is going to save the earth. And notice here, it says here, a Swedish study published in 2017 unveiled that having one fewer child per family could spare roughly 58.6 metric tons of CO2 emissions annually in high-income countries. As such, not having children is in theory the most effective measure an individual high-income country can take to reduce their carbon footprint, more than 50 times more effective than eating a plant-based diet, recycling, or not using a dryer. Here they are hammering it. And guess what? 2015, we were like, yes, sign us up. We're on your team, guys. Don't leave us out. We're following the science. Again, notice what they say here. Implementing holistic population policies could ensure that there are less people on this planet in 2100 than there are today. It is one of the cheapest and most effective emissions reduction solution today available. But this alone will be not sufficient to save our societies from the crisis we find in ourselves. In other words, the real problem is the moral turmoil we have in making these hard decisions. Now, I just want to stop right here. Think about it. In the beginning, when I did part one, I asked, how is it you can get a society that has the Word of God, has the prophets, and they warn over and over again, don't be like the nations around you. Don't sign on to human sacrifice. Don't do this, right? And in the very nation where there was a temple that was built by Solomon, that had parts put together by David, that God's own presence dwelled there, and the Ark of the Holy Covenant that prophets came to, where God said, if you come to this place and you pray, I will hear you. This very place where they had it, not far outside of the city, they would set up idols like this so that they could offer human sacrifice, so they could roast children over fire. How does that happen? How does it happen to people who have the Bible as their guide, end up doing this, end up signing on to it? And it seems so inexplicable, right? I mean, they did. How does that happen? But why are we asking how did it happen? I just showed you. From the very beginning, from that philosophy, from Malthus in 1798, working its way all the way today, that even God's people have signed on to overpopulation, abortion, sterilization. We've signed on to it because why? We do not want to be left out of the science. We do not want to be seen as not following the science. And so what do? Statement after statement on climate change. I'm sorry. I mean, you read it. You read the articles with me in the review. They were more concerned in 2000 about overpopulation than Jesus returning. And one even had the brazen attitude to say, well, thank God that He's coming back so we don't have to deal with the sin of overpopulation. Nothing to do with the Bible. Friends, if we're going to be a people by the book, we got to stop signing on to these statements. We have to stop doing these things. If the Bible is truly the Word of God, what are we doing with this? What are we doing with any of this? Because in effect, we are no different than they. We are no different than the Israelites who compromised and signed on to things that made them just like the world. If that's ever going to change, we have to become men and women of the book once again. And I pray that is our goal, and that is what we will do before it's too late. Amen.